Chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Mount Horeb, mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain.
I love that Moses is curious in this story. So am I. And like me, Moses bush isn't burned up. I can relate. Maybe you can too. Thank you. Okay. When the Lord sees that Moses has turned aside to check things out, God makes God's self present by calling Moses' name. And Moses replies to God, Here I am. A relationship begins. They have an exchange about the mystery of the burning bush, but the real mystery, the real sacred connection being forged here is that God and Moses hear and see one another. The very ground becomes sacred and life changes forever. Today's message is, I'm the first of 3 quick ones, is about call stories. This scripture is about Moses' call story, and my speaking is about mine. And in my call story, I see these same elements of curiosity, mystery, empathy, compassion, and life being changed forever and for purpose. In the beginning of my call, I had a fair amount of work to do about God. Let's just put it that way. As a child, I'd been harmed by an adult. I'd cried out to the God I understood then as a 6-year-old. And for many years, I believed that God didn't see or hear me, that God did not listen to me, much less deliver me from the harm I'd experienced. I was still traumatized, and I didn't want anything further to do with that God. The good things that people told me about God didn't fit my childhood experiences, and their insistence only made me less willing to listen. For 4 decades, my life went on that way, seemingly without God, and seemingly with a purpose that was connected to other human beings to serve, but with no kind of grand connection. I was married, I was comfortable in my husband's and my own little reality, when one day, after 19 years of marriage, he had a brain hemorrhage. I was 46, he was 52. He died 11 days later, and the world as I knew it fell apart. All the traumatic memories of what had happened to me as a child turned out to have been locked into my brain, and that jolt allowed it all to come pouring back into my consciousness. I had nightmares, and I had one really bad panic attack on the freeway while driving. One night in 1998, I found myself without anything left in the way of hope or love inside me, emotionally or spiritually. Everything hurt, and everything kept on hurting. And so I cried out to God, to the God I professed I didn't believe in, wasn't real, and what I can only describe as the peace of God surrounded me and gave me a kind of comfort that did, in fact, pass all understanding. Sorry, it gives me goosebumps now. The only way I could make sense of this was to conclude that God had been hearing and seeing me, trying to reach me all along. It was me who had shut myself away. Thanks be to God that I was humble enough at that point and broken enough at that point to listen, because that was my invitation into faith. I started attending, I was like Goldilocks, like, I want to find the right one. So I started attending churches with wildly different beliefs and practices. I was looking for a community that fit me just right. And I first found it eventually at a Disciples of Christ congregation. I began involving myself in church committee work, anything. I was so hungry. I was in the choir, even though I cried every time we started singing. I was hungry to attend all the spiritual retreats and events that I could find. Eventually, people started asking me when I was going to go to seminary. Notice, not whether, but when. And it took me a little while, but this time I trusted them and said yes. I was still saying it provisionally. I was going to go and get a church administration degree. Really? Come on, Nora. So even though I'd never wanted to become a congregational pastor, and I'm still not, even though I had no idea at first about what to do with my growing connection to pastoral care and restorative justice, even though my background was in some ways different from those I was drawn into relationship with, people in prison, people on the streets, in our cities, I had enough faith at that point to believe the promptings of the Holy Spirit and the people around me who affirmed me to keep at it. The first day I stepped inside the men's prison at Chino, almost 10 years ago now, I felt God's voice, if that makes sense. I felt God's presence. Mind you, I didn't hear God's exact words to Moses. We're not allowed to wear sandals into prison. We have to wear shoes with toes and backs. But God said to me in no uncertain terms, this is where you belong, and the place where you're standing is holy ground. And that's what I feel like every time I walk in there. Because of my call, I step into holy space, a place of growing relationships, insight, empowerment, and care. A space created and fed by punishment and violence, yes. But what a privilege and a blessing it is to be there in a space that can also be a setting to promote healthy relationships, healing, and transformation. A space that can invite new adventures into community. Someone soon, before the end of this year, from that context, will be coming to worship in this context. Maybe 2 of them. I know that this too is holy ground. And I know that that is holy ground, and it continues to be because I experience resurrection all the time. And resurrection and new life in the light of God's love are what I think our lives' journeys are all about. Thanks be to God.
When I was asked to share a story with you all in regards to what the call meant to me in my own life, I'll be honest with you, church, and say that I didn't necessarily know what to share with you today. I didn't know whether to talk about the call in relation to my occupation, or whether or not to talk about the call in reference to hearing God's voice for the first time in my life. Regardless of which call I talk about, I can assure you that I have yet to reach the person on the other line. I can't count the amount of times I've cried and prayed that God would unveil their face to me so that I could just stand in awe and amazement and hopefully get some direction into my life. But in reality, many of those days would just end up full of despair and anger towards the divine. It didn't help either that I'd be giving or receiving messages from other people, messages about what they think that I should be doing with this life that I've been given. Many who even claim to have a direct message from God. You should be pursuing your dreams. No, you should be focusing on your education. Forget all about that. Start working. There's money to be made, etc., etc., etc. With such a variety of options to choose from, which can be very anxious-provoking, how was I supposed to decipher a call from any of it? There were too many voices, and yet the only voice that I wanted to hear at that moment was not present. God's. I know this sounds pretty depressing, church, but please bear with me because I still have yet to share what I take the call to mean in my own life. When I tell you my answer, you may be a bit unsatisfied. And the reality is that I too can be unsatisfied with this answer at times. Yet the most impactful way that I've ever received any type of call from God in any way or shape or form was actually through the silence. It was by not waiting for a specific call from God. Instead, what I needed at that very moment was to simply be in the present and be captivated and aware of my full surrounding. I also had to let go of my understanding or interpretation of God as well. By not shoving and forcing God into this magic 8 ball that I would hope if I shake and stir would give me some direction into my life, as soon as I tossed that ball to the side, I was left open-handed and dealing with silence. And it was in that silence that God was able to get across to me clearer than ever before. Now, church, I didn't hear any voice, if that's what you're thinking. And I want to challenge you to know that we don't have to fear the silence, or how others also interpret it as the dark nights of the soul, right? I've also come to realize that words aren't the only way to articulate and share a message to somebody. Instead, if we're willing to listen, silence has a lot to say to us. And it was in the silence that I was able to receive this message into my heart. I'm with you right here. No matter what journey you set foot on, or whatever choices you decide to take on this life, we're by your side. I got all of that from silence, and it was all I ever really needed. I didn't get clear-cut directions about where I was supposed to go or what I was supposed to do, because there is no supposed to be doing. What's important is to simply be here, right now with us. You see, because when we're in tune with the present, with the people all around us, taking in the nature and amazement of this world, it's inevitable that love will sprout about in our hearts. When we're present about the state of nature that the world is in as well, we're better equipped to make structural changes, not just out there, but as well as in here. It's in the silent present that God calls out to me every day. And when I'm in tune with giving, but also receiving the love from my people, the community around me, it's in those instances where I can't get God to stop talking. Thank you, church.
I don't know about you, but I've really enjoyed those two. Both of you did an excellent job. I learned new stuff about you. That's great. I like that. And it sort of leads me to what I was going to say, because over my 30-something years of ministry, what I've learned is God comes at you the way you need God to come at you. God gives you what you need. So I've heard a lot of people's call stories. I've watched a lot of people be called not just to ministry, but to various professions, to make life choices. You're right, there's a lot of ways you're called. And it comes different ways for different times. That's how I envision God anyway. God gives us what we need and what is useful to us. And it may not be useful to her, but it may be useful to me. So my story, I suppose, actually begins in a way in my childhood too, because I too was abused as a child, and some of the abuse came from someone who was a spiritual leader. So I didn't have much connection with God as a child, and it wasn't pleasant what I did have, and ignored God from that point. But where my life took a turn is that when I found a church again, a spiritual community, and started experiencing God, was in the queer community. When I walked into a church my first stepping out as an out lesbian, and it was a church that was about queer people, it was all intermingled. There was no separating their sense of community as a marginalized community and God. They were all together. It was one package. So for me, I got that experience of how to be out and how to be proud and how to accept who I am and God in all in one fell swoop. So that's why whenever you talk with me about spirituality, inevitably my queerness comes in, because they're so intermingled I can't separate them anymore. They're the same thing. So for me, because I think I had such a distrust of human beings, God came at me a little bit different. In that church, God started poking at me, oh, you can do this thing. You can do that thing. And like I talked one time when I was tap dancing here when Lee's sermon went sideways, I started doing little things, and God was affirming those little things, because I don't think I was one of those people, because of my distrust of other human beings, that at that moment, if anybody walked up and said, you should be a pastor, or you gotta go, I'd have run out of that church. I did not feel ready for that, so God just walked me slowly up God. And I have always been an organizational person. I've always been a person that other people could look at and go, oh, you can organize that, you can handle that, you can do that. So they used that to get me to do stuff in church, and I started doing things, and I did more things, and I did more things, and I was in charge of more things, and I enjoyed it. It fulfilled me. It was comfortable, whatever. But there did come that day when God started putting that little thought in my head. What if you take that last step, go to seminary? What if you become a pastor? So I did the only thing that, for me, in that moment, that I could do, is I went to my pastor, Nancy Wilson. She was my pastor. You're going to hear from Nancy in our Rainbow Day. She's going to be one of our featured presenters. But at that time, she was my pastor. She was my mentor. She was my friend. And she had just happened to, during that time, have walked me through one of the spiritual crises of my life, which was coming in touch with my childhood abuse and where was God in that and how to do that. But what I learned from Nancy in that process of doing that spiritual healing was that God sometimes talks to you through other people. So you can, if you trust that person spiritually, you trust them, you can hear God through them. So God kind of set me up with that, that this is possible. And that's always been, for Nancy, one of her bedrocks. When she has made her huge spiritual commitments in life, she's looked to hear God echoing through other people. More than one, but several people, and then she can get a confirmation that this is from God. So I had already learned that from her. So I went to her and I said, it was easier to come out as a lesbian than it was to come out as somebody who wanted to be a pastor. That's a scary thing. So it was very scary to say out loud to her, I've been thinking maybe I should go to seminary and be a pastor. Didn't faze Nancy. She's one of these easy going, laid back kind of people. She didn't blink, but she said the wisest thing to me. She said, well, here's what I think you ought to do. I think you ought to take a class and it's that level. It could be in church history, it could be in Bible, whatever, something that's real deep and involved in that, and see how you feel about it. She said, if you love it, if you're all into it, you're a pastor. If you go, yo, no, I don't like this, it's terrible, I don't want to, then it's not for you. So I did that. And not only did I enjoy it, not that it was easy, Xavier, there were times, I'm not the biblical scholar a pastor is. So I struggle with a lot of that deep biblical stuff. And some of that church history stuff was boring. But here's the thing. When I went to seminary, I used to bore my friends to death. I don't know if this is true for the two of you, because I would come back to class and say, oh, did you know what I learned today about this church history tidbit, whatever, and do you know this about the Bible? And they'd look at me like, God, that is boring. Why the heck would I want to know all of that? It was not fascinating to them. It was not fun and inviting. They would sit there and go, okay, yeah. They didn't want to hear it. But as much as I struggled sometimes in my classes, and some of it wasn't as inviting as other, but it was my world. I found it. It was where I was meant to be. That's just my stuff. So I would say that about a call was true for me, and I think it's probably true for most of us. Would you find that place, whether it's your job or a call to some kind of help, or a call to a place, or a call to a community, or a call to service in the church? Would you find it? You're just going to belong. You're just going to know. And the deepest part of you, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. And the other thing that I would say, and you can see it in these 3 call stories today, is it will come the way you need it to come. I have known people that have had these blinding moments of fire and angels and whatever, and challenging things like Noah was suddenly boom, you know. But then sometimes that doesn't work for us, and God will send us people, send us moments, gradually move us until suddenly we wake up and realize where we're at, and we're not even sure how we got there. So it will come the way you need it to come. So don't go looking for a call to be, because I kind of heard that from Xavier. He was looking for a call to be a specific way, but it was the way you needed it to be. It happened the way you needed it. And God knows us all inside and out, knows what we need. So whatever God is trying to call you to, God will do it the way you need. So don't look for something out of the book. Just be open to whatever is happening in your life.
I find great satisfaction in the awareness that when Moses had his burning bush experience, he was 80. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling for you and for me. Oh, see on the portals, he's waiting and watching for you and for me. Come home, oh come home, you are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, oh sinner, come home.